Derek's hands trembled as he stared at the rejection email. The fifth one this week from Veronica, his boss. The woman who had turned his life into a living nightmare for 3 months straight. The office clock mocked him. 9:47 p.m. Caleb was home alone, probably asleep by now, waiting for a father who never seemed to come home anymore. "I can't do this," he whispered to the empty fluorescent-lit room, feeling something inside him crack. That's when she appeared in the doorway. Veronica, still in her sharp blazer, eyes unreadable in the half-light. Neither of them expected what happened next. She crossed the room in 4 steps, and suddenly her lips were on his. Desperate, shocking, impossible. Everything stopped. When she pulled back, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for driving you crazy." But that kiss changed absolutely everything. What Derek didn't know was that the woman making his life hell was fighting her own demons, and his strength was breaking down walls she'd spent 3 years building. 3 months earlier, Derek had stood in the same conference room, watching a woman in a charcoal suit walk through the door like she owned not just the building, but the air inside it. Veronica Hayes, the new creative director. Her handshake was brief, professional, cold enough to make him wonder if she'd ever smiled in her life. The previous director had been easygoing, flexible about Derek's 5 o'clock exits to pick up Caleb from the after-school program. Veronica's first email came that afternoon. A revised schedule with mandatory evening check-ins 3 times a week. No exceptions, no explanations, just expectations. Derek had tried to explain during their first one-on-one. 7-year-old son, single parent. Daycare closed at 6. She'd listened with her hands folded on the desk, expression unchanging, and then said 4 words that would echo through the next 12 weeks. "Your schedule isn't my concern." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside the glass walls, the open office buzzed with the comfortable chaos of people who got to leave at 5:30. Derek had felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, not yet, just the slow realization that the fragile balance he'd built over 9 months was about to collapse. That first week set the pattern. Every concept Derek presented came back bleeding red with Veronica's corrections. Every deadline she set assumed he had nothing but work. No small hands reaching for him at dinner time. No homework to supervise. No bedtime stories to read in voices that made Caleb laugh. The marketing firm had been Derek's safe harbor after Angela left, after the divorce papers cited his emotional unavailability and obsession with work as reasons she couldn't stay. He'd scaled back then, chose to be present, chose Caleb over the career trajectory he'd built as a senior analyst at a defense contractor. Now here was Veronica, demanding he climb back into that old skin, and he didn't know how to tell her it no longer fit. By week 3, Derek was arriving at 7 in the morning, skipping lunch, staying until Caleb called, asking when he'd be home. His son's voice on those calls got quieter each time, less hopeful. The after-school program supervisor started giving Derek looks, the kind that said she'd seen too many kids whose parents promised to do better and never did. At the office, Veronica moved through meetings like a scalpel, precise and cutting, eliminating weak ideas with a few sharp questions. Derek noticed things about her despite himself, the way she never ate lunch at her desk, never made small talk, never mentioned a family or friends, or anything that suggested a life outside these walls. The Riverside Mall rebranding project landed on Derek's desk during week 4 with the weight of a bomb. 10-week timeline, regional client with expansion ambitions, the kind of account that could define careers or end them. Veronica had called him into her office, closed the door, and outlined expectations with the efficiency of a general briefing troops. Weekend work likely, evening collaboration necessary. The presentation to the client's board would be in late March. She'd looked at him across the desk and asked if there were any questions. Derek had swallowed the words he wanted to say, that his son barely recognized him anymore, that Caleb had started drawing pictures at school of a stick figure, Dad standing far away from a stick figure boy, and said, "I'll make it work." Making it work meant Caleb eating dinner alone more nights than not, heating up the meals Derek prepared on Sundays in bulk. It meant homework, checked hastily at 8:30 when Derek finally stumbled through the door. It meant bedtime stories abandoned in favor of, "Daddy's too tired tonight, buddy." Caleb stopped complaining after the second week. That was worse somehow. The silence. The way his son would just nod and say, "It's okay," in a voice that said, nothing was okay. Derek started keeping a photo on his desk. Caleb at the beach last summer, grinning with a bucket of seashells. He looked at it during the long hours, reminded himself why he was doing this, and felt the reasoning get thinner each time. The office became a second home, though home implied comfort, and this place offered none. The other designers avoided the break room when Veronica was there. She had a way of making casual conversation feel like a performance review. Derek found himself working later, just to avoid going home to an empty apartment, to the guilt that waited there. Sometimes he'd see Veronica's office light still on at 9, 10, 11 at night. Once passing by at midnight, he'd glimpsed her through the glass, staring at her computer screen with an expression that looked less like concentration and more like punishment. Month 2 brought small, strange contradictions. Derek would arrive to find coffee on his desk, not the break room sludge, but the good stuff from the shop 2 blocks over, black like he drank it. His computer would have files organized overnight, rough concepts he'd sketched cleaned up by someone with a better eye for layout. Veronica never mentioned it, never acknowledged the way she'd stay late on the same nights he did, working in her office while he worked in the bullpen, the building empty except for them and the cleaning crew. Once their eyes met through the glass walls at 1 in the morning, she'd looked away first, but not before Derek caught something in her expression he couldn't name. The tension built through February like pressure in a sealed container. Every meeting felt like combat. Veronica would tear apart his presentations with surgical precision, then offer improvements that were, infuriatingly, always better. She pushed him harder than anyone ever had, expected excellence as a baseline and brilliance as the goal. Derek hated it. Hated her. Hated the way she made him want to prove he could meet those impossible standards. They circled each other in the office space like fighters in a ring, waiting for the other to break first. The breaking point came at 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon when the school nurse called. Caleb's fever had spiked to 102. Someone needed to pick him up immediately. Derek had been in the middle of presenting the initial Riverside concepts to Veronica and the account team. He'd stood there, phone buzzing in his pocket, watching Veronica's eyes narrow at the interruption. When he'd excused himself to take the call, her voice had followed him. "This is the 3rd time this month, Derek." The other designers had looked away, embarrassed witnesses to his humiliation. He'd turned in the doorway, something hot and desperate rising in his chest. "I'm doing my best. I'm alone in this." The words came out harder than he'd intended. Veronica had gone very still. For a moment, the conference room held its breath. Then she'd said quietly, "Go. Take care of your son." The meeting had dissolved after that, people filing out with their heads down. Derek had grabbed his coat and left, but not before catching the expression on Veronica's face. Raw, exposed, quickly masked. Later, he'd wonder what he'd seen there. Later, he'd understand. Caleb had been small and hot in the nurse's office, forehead burning against Derek's palm. They'd gone home, Derek calling in sick for the next day without asking permission. He'd spent Friday on the couch with Caleb curled against him, watching cartoons and feeling his son's fever slowly break. Caleb had looked up at him at one point and said, "You stayed home." Just that. Like it was a miracle. Derek had held him tighter and felt something crack in the architecture of his carefully maintained composure. When he'd returned Monday, there was a note on his desk in Veronica's precise handwriting. "Take the time you need. Meeting rescheduled to Wednesday. Nothing more. No judgment, no reprimand." Derek had stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile this small mercy with the woman who'd spent 2 months driving him to the edge. He'd looked up to find her watching from her office, and when their eyes met this time, she didn't look away. Something passed between them, recognition maybe, or understanding, before she turned back to her screen. The final push through March was brutal. The client presentation loomed like Judgment Day. Derek worked 16-hour days, survived on coffee, and the sandwiches that kept appearing in the break room fridge with his name on them. The campaign came together piece by piece, a nostalgic rebrand that positioned Riverside Mall not as retail space, but as community center, the heart of suburban life. It was good work. Better than good. Veronica had approved the final deck with a nod that felt, impossibly, like respect. The chemistry between them had become undeniable by then, at least to Derek. The way she'd lean over his shoulder to point at a layout, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive. The way their hands would brush passing files, and both would freeze for half a heartbeat. The way she'd started asking about Caleb, careful questions that suggested she actually listened to his answers. Derek told himself it meant nothing. She was his boss. He was a single father barely keeping his head above water. Nothing could happen. Nothing would happen. But late nights had a way of stripping away pretense. With the office empty and the city lights spread below them, they'd started talking about more than work. Small revelations at first. Veronica mentioning she hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. Derek admitting he'd given up his security clearance when Caleb was born. Bigger ones later. Her failed marriage. His divorce. The way both of them used work to avoid dealing with the wreckage of their lives. They never touched, never crossed that line. But something was building between them like static before lightning. The client presentation nearly ended in disaster. Derek's laptop had crashed 15 minutes before the meeting, taking the entire presentation with it. He'd stood in the conference room watching the executives from Riverside Mall file in, feeling panic ice his veins. Then training kicked in, the muscle memory from his years analyzing satellite imagery and compiling briefings under pressure. He'd started talking, rebuilding the presentation from memory, sketching concepts on the whiteboard, walking them through the strategy with a confidence that surprised even himself. Veronica had watched from the side of the room, expression unreadable. They'd won the account. 2-year contract, option for expansion. The team had celebrated at a bar that night, but Derek had left early to get home to Caleb. He'd found his son still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a drawing. "I made this for you," Caleb had said, pushing the paper across. It showed 2 stick figures standing close together this time, holding hands. "That's us," his son explained. "Together again." Derek had taped it to the refrigerator and let himself feel something dangerous. Hope. The Thursday after the victory, Veronica had called Derek into her office at 4:30. He'd assumed another project, another impossible deadline. Instead, she'd closed the door and said, "You can go home at 5 from now on. You've more than proven yourself." Derek had stared at her. "I don't understand." She'd looked at him for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "I pushed you too hard. I see that now. You don't have to choose between being a good employee and a good father. I was wrong to make you feel like you did." The apology had undone something in Derek, some defensive wall he'd been maintaining. "Why?" he'd asked. "Why push so hard?" Veronica had turned to the window, hands clasped behind her back. "I had a daughter once, Melody. She died 3 years ago." The words fell like stones into still water. "Car accident. I was working late. My husband picked her up from daycare. A drunk driver ran a red light." Derek had felt the air leave the room. "My marriage ended because he blamed me for not being there. Maybe he was right. So I buried myself in work because feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. And then I saw you, fighting to be present for your son despite everything. And She'd trailed off. Derek had crossed the office before conscious thought, standing close enough to see the tears she was fighting. "You don't get to carry that alone," he'd said quietly. "The guilt, the what-ifs, it'll eat you alive." She'd looked at him then, really looked at him, and something shifted. "How do you do it? Keep going?" Derek had thought about Caleb's drawing on the refrigerator, about the small hand that reached for his every morning. "I don't have a choice. He needs me. So I show up." Veronica had nodded slowly. "I haven't shown up for anything in 3 years." Her voice had cracked. I don't know how anymore. The final Friday in March brought them back to where they'd started. Late night, empty office, the city humming 20 floors below. The Riverside campaign was finished, delivered, approved. Derek should have been home hours ago, but he'd stayed to help Veronica prep for the quarterly review. They'd worked side by side, the silence comfortable now instead of tense. At 9:30, Derek had stood to stretch, exhaustion pulling at every muscle. He'd thought about Caleb asleep at home with the neighbor checking in, about how this would be the last late night, about how he'd managed to survive 3 months in Veronica's crosshairs and somehow come out intact. That's when his control had finally broken. The stress, the guilt, the grinding exhaustion of trying to be enough for everyone all the time. Derek had felt it crack down the middle like ice under pressure. "I can't do this anymore," he'd said to the empty room, not quite sure what this meant. "I can't keep pretending I'm okay, that I'm not failing, that I don't miss my son every second I'm here, that I don't—" He'd stopped, swallowing the rest, failing at this too. Always failing. Veronica had appeared in the doorway like she'd materialized from his thoughts. Still in her blazer, hair coming loose from its professional twist, eyes that had learned to read him over 3 months of proximity. "You're not failing," she'd said quietly. "You're the strongest person I know." Derek had shaken his head, the emotions he'd been suppressing for weeks spilling over. "I'm exhausted. I'm alone. My son barely knows me. And you?" He'd looked at her, this woman who'd put him through hell and somehow made him better for it. "You've been driving me crazy, but maybe I needed that. Maybe I needed someone to push me, to see I could be more than I thought I was." She'd crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, could count the breaths between them. "I was hard on you because I saw what I'd lost. A parent who actually fights, who shows up even when it's hard, who doesn't let work consume everything." Her voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "I was jealous, and I was falling for you, and it terrified me because everyone I love leaves or dies, and I couldn't survive losing someone else." The confession had hung in the air between them, fragile as glass. Derek had reached up without thinking, fingers brushing her cheek. "I'm not going anywhere." Veronica had closed her eyes, leaning into the touch like someone starving for connection. "I'm sorry for driving you crazy." The words broke something open. She'd kissed him then, desperate, shocking, impossible, closing the gap that had yawned between them for 3 months. Derek had frozen for half a heartbeat before kissing her back, tasting salt that might have been her tears, or his, or both. The kiss lasted 10 seconds, or 10 years, time folding in on itself. When they'd pulled apart, both breathing hard, Veronica's eyes were wide with something like fear. "I shouldn't have—" Derek had silenced her with a finger against her lips. "Don't apologize." "Not for this." They'd stood there in the fluorescent light, the city glittering outside, 2 people who'd been alone for too long, finding unexpected salvation in each other's arms. Everything had changed. They both knew it. The question was what came next. The weekend had passed in a haze of confusion and careful distance. Derek had spent Saturday and Sunday with Caleb, taking him to the park, teaching him to ride a bike without training wheels, being present in ways he hadn't managed in months. His son had bloomed under the attention, laughing more, talking more, asking if they could do this every weekend. Yes, Derek had promised, and meant it. But in the quiet moments, Caleb asleep, apartment dark, he'd thought about Veronica's mouth on his, her confession, the way she'd looked at him like he was the answer to a question she'd been afraid to ask. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Derek had walked into the office expecting everything to be different, but Veronica wasn't there. Her office sat empty, lights off, the space looking abandoned. Panic had touched his chest, the irrational fear that she'd fled, that Friday night had been too much, that he'd lost something before he'd fully understood he had it. Then he'd seen the email, time-stamped from 6 that morning. "Derek, I needed time to think. What happened Friday crossed every professional boundary. If you want me to arrange a transfer to another team, I will." I'm sorry if I've made your position here untenable. Derek had read it 3 times, each pass making him angrier. She thought he wanted distance, thought she'd ruined something. Didn't understand that she'd been the first person in 3 years to make him feel alive, to make him want something more than just surviving day to day. He'd started typing a response, deleted it, started again. Words weren't enough. He needed to see her, needed her to understand that the kiss hadn't been a mistake. It had been inevitable. He'd found her at 4:30 that afternoon in the parking garage, sitting in her car with the engine off. Derek had tapped on the window, watched her startle. When she'd rolled down the glass, he could see she'd been crying. I don't want to transfer, he'd said without preamble. I don't want distance. I don't want to pretend Friday didn't happen. Veronica had looked up at him, mascara smudged, walls down for maybe the first time since they'd met. I don't know how to do this, how to feel things and not destroy them, how to let someone in when everyone leaves. Derek had opened the car door, crouched beside her seat so they were eye level. You think I know how? I'm terrified. I've got a 7-year-old who needs stability, a job I can't afford to lose, and I just kissed my boss in an empty office, like I'm in some kind of romance novel. This is insane, Veronica had laughed, a wet, broken sound. Completely insane. Then, quieter. But I can't stop thinking about you, about how you've changed everything, about how maybe I don't want to be numb anymore. They'd talked in that parking garage until the security guard came through making his rounds. Veronica had told him about Melody in detail this time. Her laugh, her favorite stuffed elephant, the way she'd demand 3 bedtime stories instead of 1, the guilt that came after, the divorce, the years of trying to work hard enough to forget. Derek had shared Angela's final words before she left. You're so busy trying to save the world, you can't see your family drowning right in front of you. The way those words had haunted him, driven every choice since. Maybe we're both just people who loved too hard and lost too much, Veronica had said finally. Maybe we're trying to protect ourselves by not trying at all. Derek had taken her hand, lacing their fingers together. Or maybe we could try together, see if 2 broken people can make something whole. She'd squeezed his hand, a lifeline in dark water. I want that. God, I want that. But I'm scared of hurting you, of failing you the way I failed everyone else. Derek had leaned in, pressed his forehead to hers. Then we'll fail together, and we'll get back up together. That's what people do. The decision to try had come with complications. HR needed notification. Office gossip would be inevitable. They'd have to navigate the power dynamic carefully, keep things professional at work, even as they explored something personal outside it. But before any of that, Derek needed Veronica to understand what she was signing up for. Caleb comes first, he'd said. Always. I can't be the kind of partner who puts you above my son. I won't be that person again. Veronica had nodded, eyes serious. I wouldn't want you to be. The man who chooses his kid over everything else. That's who I fell for. The first official date had been awkward in the way first dates always are, multiplied by the fact they'd already shared an office kiss and several emotional breakdowns. They'd gone to a quiet restaurant outside the city, somewhere they wouldn't run into coworkers. Veronica had worn jeans and a sweater, her hair down, looking softer than Derek had ever seen her. They'd talked about everything except work, favorite books, worst vacations, childhood dreams. Derek learned she'd wanted to be an artist before business school had seemed more practical. Veronica learned Derek had been on track for NSA recruitment before Caleb was born, that he'd walked away from intelligence work without a second thought. Do you miss it? She'd asked over dessert. The important work? Derek had thought about classified briefings and threat assessments and the weight of information that could change policy. Sometimes. But nothing I did there was more important than Caleb's homework or his bedtime stories, or just being there when he needs me. That's the work that matters. Veronica had gone quiet, something raw crossing her face. I wish I'd understood that before it was too late. Derek had reached across the table, covered her hand with his. You're understanding it now. That's what matters. The real test, came on a Saturday morning 3 weeks into whatever they were calling this relationship. Derek had opened his door to find Veronica standing there with coffee and pastries, looking nervous. "I know this is fast, but I thought I'd like to meet Caleb, if that's okay." Derek's heart had stuttered. "You're sure? Meeting the kid is everything, I know." She'd met his eyes. "I'm sure." So Derek had let her in, called Caleb down from his room, and made introductions that felt momentous and ordinary all at once. Caleb had studied Veronica with the serious expression kids got when measuring new adults. "You're my dad's friend?" She'd crouched to his level, which Derek appreciated. "I am. And I work with him too." Caleb had considered this. "He talks about you sometimes, says you're really smart." Veronica had glanced at Derek, surprised. "Does he?" Caleb had nodded. "And that you push him to do his best work. That's good. Dad needs people who believe in him." The simple truth of it, delivered in a 7-year-old's matter-of-fact voice, had nearly undone both adults. Veronica had blinked rapidly, composing herself. "Your dad is a pretty amazing person. I'm lucky to know him." Caleb had grinned. "He's the best. He teaches me stuff and makes funny voices when he reads stories, and always comes to my school stuff now." The emphasis on now had cut like a knife, a reminder of those months when Derek hadn't been present. But Caleb had moved on already, grabbing Veronica's hand. "Want to see my Lego city? I built it myself." Derek had watched them disappear into Caleb's room, heard his son's excited chatter and Veronica's genuine questions, and felt something slot into place. This could work. This strange, unlikely thing that had started with late nights and brutal deadlines, and a kiss that changed everything. It wouldn't be easy. There would be complications, adjustments, moments where old wounds reopened. But maybe that was okay. Maybe healing wasn't about finding someone perfect, but finding someone willing to sit in the mess with you. They'd spent the morning together, the three of them. Breakfast had been pancakes that Derek made while Veronica helped Caleb set the table. They'd talked and laughed, and Derek had noticed how Veronica watched Caleb with a tenderness that bordered on pain, like she was seeing not just his son, but the daughter she'd lost. He'd wanted to tell her it was okay, that she could love Caleb without betraying Melody's memory, but some things couldn't be said. They had to be learned through living. After Veronica left, Caleb had climbed into Derek's lap on the couch. "I like her, Dad." Derek had hugged him close. "Yeah? What do you like about her?" Caleb had thought about it with the seriousness he brought to important questions. "She looked at you the way you look at me, like you're the most important person in the world. And she asked me real questions, not grown-up pretend questions, and..." He'd paused. She seemed sad, like she needed a friend too. Kids saw things adults tried to hide. Derek had kissed the top of Caleb's head. She did need a friend. We both needed friends, I think. And we found each other. Caleb had nodded against his chest. "That's good. Everyone needs people who care about them. That's what you always tell me." Derek had felt his throat tighten. "That's right, buddy. Everyone needs people who care." They'd sat like that for a long time, father and son, while outside the world continued its spin and inside something new took root. The following weeks brought changes both subtle and seismic. At the office, Derek and Veronica maintained professional distance, but everyone could sense the shift. Meetings were less tense. Feedback came wrapped in encouragement instead of criticism. Veronica started leaving at 6, joining the exodus of people with lives outside work. The whispers started, hushed speculation about the boss and the single dad. But when HR signed off on the relationship disclosure, the gossip lost its teeth. They were just two people, figuring things out. Outside work, they built something careful and genuine. Veronica came to Caleb's soccer games, cheered from the sidelines, learned the names of his teammates. Derek met her for lunch on Saturdays, while Caleb was at his friend's house, talked about art and dreams, and the future they were slowly constructing. They moved at the pace of people who'd learned that rushing toward happiness often meant losing it. Some nights Veronica would have dinner with them, staying until Caleb's bedtime before heading home. Other nights, Derek would go to her place after Caleb was asleep, the neighbor checking in, and they'd talk or not talk, learning each other's silence. The past didn't disappear. Veronica still had nights where grief ambushed her, where she'd see a little girl with dark hair and have to step away until she could breathe again. Derek still carried guilt about the year he'd been absent from Caleb's life, the husband he'd been to Angela. They learned to hold space for each other's ghosts, to understand that healing wasn't linear and some wounds never fully closed. But they also learned joy, small moments of happiness that accumulated like compound interest. 3 months after the kiss that changed everything, Derek had been helping Caleb with homework when Veronica called. "I did something," she'd said without preamble. "Something I should have asked about first. But I was afraid if I asked you'd say no, so I just did it. And now I need to tell you." Derek had felt alarm spike. "What did you do?" There'd been a pause, then. "I signed us up for art classes, all 3 of us, Saturday mornings. I thought maybe we could create something together, something new." Derek had looked at Caleb's math worksheet, at the dinosaur stickers his son had used to decorate the margins, at the evidence of a childhood he was finally showing up for. "Art classes," he'd repeated. "Yeah, painting, drawing, whatever. I haven't made art since before Melody was born, before I decided practical was more important than passionate. And I thought maybe it's not too late to choose differently." Her voice had wavered. "Maybe I could teach Caleb what I never taught my daughter. Maybe we could all learn something together." The vulnerability in her words had cracked something open in Derek's chest. "We'd love that," he'd said quietly. "All of us." Veronica had exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. "Yeah? Yeah. Thank you for choosing us, for choosing to try." There'd been silence on the line, the weight of gratitude too big for words. Then Caleb had looked up from his homework and asked, "Was that V?" Derek had nodded. "She signed us up for art classes." Caleb's face had split into a grin. "Cool. Can I make paintings for my room?" The first art class had been chaos in the best way. Caleb had attacked the canvas with enthusiasm, creating abstracts that looked like fireworks frozen in time. Veronica had been tentative at first, brush hovering over white space like she'd forgotten permission to make mistakes. Derek had painted simple landscapes, mountains and trees, the kind of safe choices that revealed nothing. They'd gone home covered in paint, laughing at the mess, and Veronica had looked younger than he'd ever seen her. Lighter, like she'd set down weight she'd been carrying too long. They'd made it a tradition. Saturday morning art class, followed by breakfast at the diner Caleb loved, then whatever the day brought. Some weeks they'd go to the park, others to a museum, sometimes just home to watch movies and build pillow forts. Veronica became a fixture in their lives, not replacing Angela. There was no replacement, no need for one, but adding something new. She brought structure when Derek got overwhelmed, creativity when he got stuck in routine, softness when the world felt too hard. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she healed. Derek watched it happen in increments, the first time she laughed without the shadow of guilt following after. The afternoon she told him about Melody's favorite book and didn't cry. The evening she called him at 10 just to talk, to share her day, to connect without crisis. The morning she woke up in his bed, Caleb safe at a friend's sleepover, and said, "I'm happy. I didn't think I'd ever feel that again, but I'm happy." Derek had pulled her closer, kissed her temple, felt gratitude wash through him like absolution. "Me too." And he was. Not the manic happiness of early love, but something deeper, the steady contentment of partnership, of shared burden, of choosing each other every day. They'd found it in the aftermath of chaos, in the space between late nights and early mornings, in a kiss that should have been impossible, but turned out to be inevitable. The 6-month mark arrived on a Tuesday in September. Derek had taken Veronica and Caleb to the beach, the same one from the photo on his desk, the one that seemed a lifetime ago now. They'd built sandcastles and splashed in the waves and collected shells in buckets. At sunset, Caleb had run ahead chasing seagulls, and Veronica had slipped her hand into Derek's. "Thank you," she'd said quietly. He'd looked at her, this woman who'd driven him crazy and saved him in equal measure. For what? For not giving up on me, for seeing past the armor to the mess underneath, for letting me be part of this. She gestured at Caleb's distant figure, silhouetted against the dying light. For showing me it's not too late to have a family. To try again. Derek had stopped walking, turned to face her fully. The ocean roared behind them, eternal and indifferent. You didn't need saving. You needed someone to stand beside you while you saved yourself. That's all I did. Veronica had cupped his face in her hands, eyes bright with unshed tears. You made me want to try. That's everything. She'd kissed him then, soft and sure, a promise instead of a question. When they'd pulled apart, Caleb was running back toward them, bucket swinging, face alight with joy. "Dad! V! Look what I found!" He'd shown them a perfectly spiraled shell, pink and white, and unmarked by time. "It's beautiful," Veronica had said, crouching down. "What are you going to do with it?" Caleb had thought about it, then held it out to her. "You keep it, so you remember today." Veronica had taken the shell with shaking hands, and Derek had watched her fold around the gesture like someone protecting a flame from wind. "Thank you, Caleb. I'll treasure it always." The boy had beamed and run off again, back to his explorations, leaving the two adults standing in the sand, with the weight of small kindnesses passing between them. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Derek and Veronica had sat on his balcony watching the city lights. She'd been turning the shell over in her hands, studying its curves. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she'd admitted. "For something to go wrong, for you to realize I'm too broken, for this to be too good to be real." Derek had taken the shell from her hands, set it carefully on the table between them, then laced his fingers with hers. "Nothing about this is perfect. We're two people with damage and baggage, and kids to think about. We're going to mess up, have bad days, fight about stupid things. But," Veronica had prompted. Derek had smiled. "But we're doing it together. And maybe that's what love is. Not finding someone who completes you, but finding someone who helps you complete yourself." She'd rested her head on his shoulder, exhaling tension. "When did you get so wise?" He'd laughed. "I'm not wise. I'm just a guy who got a second chance and doesn't want to waste it." They'd sat like that until the stars came out, until the city below them grew quiet, until the only sound was breathing in sync. The photograph on Derek's desk at work had expanded. Now it included 3 people on the beach, Derek, Caleb, and Veronica, caught mid-laugh by a passing stranger who'd offered to take their picture. He looked at it sometimes during long days, reminded himself how far he'd come from the man who'd stood in an empty office 9 months ago, feeling like failure was the only future he had. That man had been drowning. This man was learning to swim. At a company event in October, someone had asked Veronica what had changed, why she seemed different. She'd glanced across the room at Derek, talking with the design team, Caleb's latest drawing folded in his pocket, because his son had insisted he bring it to work. "I remembered what matters," she'd said simply. "I forgot for a while, but someone reminded me." The coworker had followed her gaze, smiled knowingly. "He's good for you." Veronica had nodded. "He saved my life. Both of them did." But that wasn't quite right, Derek thought when she told him the story later. He hadn't saved her. They'd saved each other, found in the ruins of their separate disasters a way to build something new. Love like that wasn't rescue. It was recognition. 2 people seeing the hurt in each other and choosing to witness it, hold space for it, believe in healing even when healing seemed impossible. The photograph on Derek's desk at work had expanded. Now it included 3 people on the beach, Derek, Caleb, and Veronica, caught mid-laugh by a passing stranger who'd offered to take their picture. He looked at it sometimes during long days, reminded himself how far he'd come from the man who'd stood in an empty office 9 months ago, feeling like failure was the only future he had. That man had been drowning. This man was learning to swim. At a company event in October, someone had asked Veronica what had changed, why she seemed different. She'd glanced across the room at Derek, talking with the design team, Caleb's latest drawing folded in his pocket because his son had insisted he bring it to work. "I remembered what matters," she'd said simply. "I forgot for a while, but someone reminded me." The co-worker had followed her gaze, smiled knowingly. "He's good for you." Veronica had nodded. "He saved my life." Both of them did. But that wasn't quite right, Derek thought when she told him the story later. He hadn't saved her. They'd saved each other, found in the ruins of their separate disasters a way to build something new. Love like that wasn't rescue. It was recognition. Two people seeing the hurt in each other and choosing to witness it, hold space for it, believe in healing, even when healing seemed impossible. The holidays approached with their particular brand of chaos. Derek had worried about traditions, about how to blend old routines with new realities. Veronica had worried about overstepping, about being too much or not enough. In the end, they'd created something uniquely theirs. Thanksgiving dinner, with just the three of them, Caleb helping make pie, while Veronica and Derek attempted a turkey that came out only slightly dry. Christmas shopping together, Caleb dragging them through stores with lists for Santa that grew more elaborate by the day. New Year's Eve spent on the couch with hot chocolate and a movie, Caleb falling asleep between them before midnight, Derek and Veronica exchanging a kiss at 12 that felt like vows. Through it all, they learned each other's rhythms. Derek learned that Veronica needed silence in the mornings, coffee before conversation, space to gather herself before facing the day. Veronica learned that Derek processed emotion through movement, cooking, cleaning, building things with his hands. Caleb learned he could love someone new without betraying his mother, that families could grow and change and that was okay. They all learned that happiness wasn't a destination, but a practice, something you chose and recalibrated and chose again every single day. The 1-year anniversary of Veronica's arrival at the firm came and went with little fanfare, but Derek marked it privately, thought about the woman who'd walked into his life like a storm and changed every assumption he'd had about his future. She'd driven him crazy, pushed him past breaking points, demanded more than he thought he could give. And in doing so, she'd given him back parts of himself he'd thought were lost forever. Ambition, passion, the belief that he could be both a good father and a full person. On a quiet Sunday morning in January, Derek woke to find Veronica already up, standing at the window watching snow fall over the city. He'd joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" She'd leaned back into him. "How different this is from a year ago. How I was so alone then, and didn't even realize it because I'd convinced myself alone was safer." Derek had kissed her shoulder. "And now?" She'd turned in his arms, eyes clear and certain. "Now I know the truth. Safe isn't the same as living, and I'd rather live, really live, with all the mess and risk and beauty that comes with it." Caleb had appeared in the doorway then, pajamas rumpled and hair sticking up. "It's snowing." He'd run to the window, pressed his face against the glass. "Can we build a snowman?" Derek and Veronica had looked at each other, communicating in that wordless way they'd developed. "Get dressed," Derek had told his son. "We'll meet you downstairs in 10 minutes. Caleb had whooped and raced off. Veronica had raised an eyebrow. "We're building snowmen at 7 in the morning?" Derek had grinned. "We're building snowmen at 7 in the morning." And they had. The three of them in the courtyard of Derek's building, breath fogging in the cold air, hands numb and cheeks red, constructing a family of snow people that leaned slightly to one side, but stood together nonetheless. Other residents had emerged to watch or join, smiling at the trio's laughter. By the time they'd finished, the sun was fully up and Caleb was demanding hot chocolate. They'd trudged back inside, tracking snow and joy in equal measure. Later, warming their hands around mugs while Caleb watched cartoons, Veronica had said, "I want to tell you something." Derek had set down his chocolate, heart suddenly loud in his ears. She'd taken his hands, held them tight. "I love you. I've loved you for months now, maybe from the beginning, even when I was too scared to admit it. You and Caleb, you're my family now, if you'll have me." Derek had felt emotion close his throat. "I love you too. So much it terrifies me sometimes. And yes, 1,000 times, yes, we'll have you." They'd kissed then, soft and slow, the taste of chocolate and promise lingering between them. From the living room, Caleb had called out, "Are you guys being mushy again?" They'd broken apart laughing. "Maybe a little," Derek had called back. "Gross," Caleb had responded, but his voice had been full of fondness. Later, he'd appear with a drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled Dad, me, and V, and stick it on the refrigerator next to all the others. A family, growing and changing and choosing each other every day. The story could end there, with promises made and love declared, with the neat resolution of a fairy tale. But real life was messier than fairy tales. There would be hard days ahead, arguments about parenting styles, moments where old wounds reopened, times when they'd have to choose each other all over again. Veronica would struggle with guilt on Melody's birthday, on the anniversary of the accident. Derek would wrestle with the specter of Angela, with the fear that history would repeat itself. Caleb would have days where he missed his mother, where the complexity of his new family felt like too much. But they'd face it together. That was the promise underneath all the other promises. Not that things would be perfect, but that they'd show up. They'd do the work. They'd choose presence over absence, vulnerability over armor, love over fear. They'd build something imperfect and real, and theirs, constructed from the debris of their separate disasters into something resembling hope. On a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 1 year after the kiss that changed everything, Derek stood in his kitchen making dinner, while Veronica helped Caleb with math homework at the table. The scene was ordinary, mundane even, the kind of moment that would never make a story worth telling. But to Derek, this was the miracle. Not the dramatic revelation or the passionate kiss, but the quiet evening where the woman he loved explained fractions to his son while he chopped vegetables for stir-fry. The everyday magic of people showing up for each other, choosing each other, building a life one small decision at a time. Veronica looked up and caught him watching. "What?" Derek shook his head, smiling. "Nothing. Just thinking about how you drove me crazy." She raised an eyebrow. "Past tense." He laughed. "Present tense, too. But the good kind of crazy. The kind where I can't imagine my life without you in it." She'd flushed, pleased and embarrassed in equal measure. Caleb had looked between them. "You guys are weird," he'd announced, "but I like it. We're a good weird family." A good weird family. Derek tucked that phrase away like a treasure, something to hold against the dark when doubt crept in. Because Caleb was right. They were weird, this cobbled-together group of people learning to be whole. But they were good. They were trying. And sometimes, Derek thought as he returned to chopping vegetables while his son's laughter filled the kitchen and Veronica's hand briefly touched his back in passing, sometimes trying was enough. Sometimes showing up was the victory. Sometimes love looked like math homework and stir-fry, and choosing each other again on a random Tuesday evening. The office clock read 6:15. Outside, the city was settling into evening, lights beginning to glow in the dusk. A year ago, this time would have found Derek still hunched over his desk, Caleb home alone, future narrowing to a point of exhaustion and guilt. Now he was here, in this moment, with these people, his boss who'd become his partner, his son who'd learned to trust again, himself, somehow stitched back together into something resembling whole. That night, after Caleb was asleep and Veronica was curled against him on the couch, she'd asked the question that had been hanging between them for months. "Do you ever regret it? That night in the office?" Derek had considered the question seriously, thought about all the complications that Kiss had introduced, all the ways it had upended the careful life he'd built. "No," he'd said finally. "I regret a lot of things. But not that. Never that." Veronica had nodded against his chest. Me either. Scared me to death. But I don't regret it. They'd sat in comfortable silence, the television playing something neither was watching. Then Derek had said, "You know what the crazy part is? I thought you were going to destroy me. Those first few months I genuinely believed you were the worst thing that could have happened to me." Veronica had lifted her head, eyes searching his face. And now? He'd cupped her cheek, thumb brushing along her jaw. "Now, I know you're the best thing that ever happened to me. You drove me crazy because you saw who I could be and refused to let me settle for less. You pushed me because you believed I was worth pushing. You loved me before I knew I was worth loving." Tears had gathered in Veronica's eyes. "You were always worth loving. You just couldn't see it." Derek had kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "Neither could you. Guess we had to find each other to figure it out." She'd smiled through the tears. "Guess so. Lucky us." Lucky them indeed. Two people who'd been drowning in separate oceans, who'd found each other in the wreckage and learned to swim together. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. The story didn't end with a grand gesture or dramatic finale. It ended the way real stories do, with an ordinary evening in an ordinary apartment, with a child sleeping down the hall and two adults learning to build something lasting from the fragments of their pasts. Derek looked at the woman beside him, this woman who'd driven him crazy and saved him and loved him in all his messy, complicated reality, and felt something close to peace settle in his chest. "Stay," he said quietly, though she already had her toothbrush in the bathroom, clothes in his dresser, half her life entwined with his. "I mean, really stay. Move in. Make this official. Build something permanent." Veronica had gone very still. "You're sure? With Caleb, with everything?" Derek had silenced her with a kiss. "I'm sure. We're sure." "Right, buddy," he'd called toward the hallway, where a small figure had appeared, clearly eavesdropping. Caleb had walked over in his pajamas, climbed onto the couch between them. "Vi should definitely stay," he'd announced. "She makes good pancakes, and she's teaching me to paint, and Dad smiles more when she's here. Plus, we're a family now. Families stay together." Out of the mouths of children. Veronica had pulled Caleb into a hug, holding him tight, while emotions played across her face too fast to name. "Then I guess I'm staying," she'd said, voice thick. "If you're sure you want me." Caleb had pulled back, looked at her with the seriousness that sometimes made him seem older than his years. "We want you. Always." And that was it. No dramatic music, no sunset backdrop, just a family, found and chosen and built from the ruins of other lives, deciding to make it official. They'd stay up late that night, talking logistics, planning the merge of households, making lists and laughing at the absurdity of it all. But underneath the practical details was something more profound. The decision to trust, to commit, to believe that the happiness they'd found could last beyond the initial rush of new love. The city lights glittered outside the window. Inside, three people sat together on a couch, building a future one conversation at a time. It had started with late nights and impossible demands, with a woman who drove a single dad crazy and a kiss that changed everything. But it had become something else entirely, a love story built on presence and patience, on showing up even when things got hard, on choosing each other every single day. Derek thought about the man he'd been a year ago, exhausted, alone, convinced he had to choose between being a good father and being a whole person. That man wouldn't recognize this moment, this life, this family. And thank God for that. Thank God for the woman who'd refused to let him settle, who'd pushed him past his limits and shown him what was possible on the other side. Thank God for second chances and unexpected grace and love that arrived in the least likely package. "What are you thinking?" Veronica asked, noting his faraway expression. Derek pulled her closer, felt Caleb's weight warm against his other side. "Just that you drove me crazy. Still do sometimes." She laughed. "Good. Life should be a little crazy. Keeps things interesting." He kissed her temple. "You've got no idea what you've signed up for. We're a lot." Veronica looked at Caleb, dozing off between them, then back at Derek. "I know exactly what I signed up for. A family, a life, a chance to be happy again. I'll take it. Chaos and all." The television continued its background murmur. Outside, the city kept spinning, indifferent to the small miracles happening in apartments across its sprawl. But here, in this moment, 3 people found the thing everyone seeks and so few find: a place to belong. A person, or 2, to belong with. The knowledge that showing up matters, that presence is the greatest gift, that love in its truest form is simply choosing someone again and again and again. Derek closed his eyes, let himself feel the weight of contentment. He'd been driven crazy by the woman now sleeping against his shoulder. But somewhere in that madness, he'd found everything he didn't know he needed. And that, he thought, as sleep pulled him under, was the real story. Not the dramatic moments or the passionate kisses, though those mattered too, but the ordinary evening a year later, choosing to stay, choosing to build, choosing love even when it was complicated and messy and hard. Sometimes the person who drives you crazy is exactly the person you need. Sometimes the worst thing that could happen turns out to be the best thing. Sometimes love arrives not in the package you expected, but in the exact form you needed. Derek had learned all of this the hard way, through late nights and breaking points, and a kiss that changed absolutely everything. But he'd learned, and he'd stayed, and he'd chosen. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The rest was just details. Beautiful, important, worth it details that added up to a life lived fully, loved fiercely, and earned through the hardest work there is. Showing up for the people who matter, every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The story ended the way all good stories do, not with an ending at all, but with a beginning. A family learning to be whole, a love learning to last, a man learning that being driven crazy by the right person was the sanest thing that ever happened to him. And somewhere in the city below, in offices and apartments and lives unfolding in real time, other people were having their own moments of grace, finding their own second chances, learning their own lessons about presence and patience and the transformative power of showing up. The work continued, as it always would. But for now, in this moment, Derek allowed himself to rest, to trust, to believe. He'd been driven crazy. He'd been saved. He'd found family in the least likely place. And he was, against all odds and expectations, happy. Really, truly, earned through struggle happy. That was the miracle. That was the story. That was enough.